Welcome. Welcome to you all. My name is Sam Holtzman. I'll be presenting our webinar today on the top 10 questions and answers to demystify enterprise architecture. This is one of our ongoing webinars that we've run anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks apart, depending on what the topics are. This one has gotten a lot of interest from a lot of people as to what really enterprise architecture is. For those of you that are online with us now, fantastic. This session is being recorded also, so there's some colleagues that have missed this webinar. You'll be able to get to that, and we will get you a link later on today or tomorrow. We'll have an email for you on that. And basically, our topic for today is what is enterprise architecture? We're going to start off with a bit of humor, I think, here. When I actually put this thing together, I came up with 12 different questions that were common from our consulting practice here, rather than the 10, but I wanted to leave the title the same. And it was something I learned a long time ago. It turns out that there are two types of people out there when it comes to understanding mathematics. Well, there's actually three types of people that understand different things about mathematics, and this is what the joke is about. There are those that understand math and those that don't. And so therefore, forgive me for saying 12 rather than 10. The first thing we're going to do is to discuss what actually is enterprise architecture. The reason we're going to do that is one of the great things about the internet is anybody can write anything about anything, and the problem with the internet is anybody can write anything about anything, and that's what we have to first address. What actually is enterprise architecture that's there? Second thing is, how long has enterprise architecture been around? The reason this is important is that we believe that we're in what we refer to as enterprise architecture 3.0, and we're coming back around to the original intent of our enterprise architecture. And when we get into this section, you'll see that architecture actually began in 1966. It did not begin, as the internet suggests and a lot of different people suggest, in the late 80s or late 90s. And of course, this is important because if you don't have that history, we tend to make the same mistakes over and over again. And that's what we saw in EA 2.0. As we're getting into 3.0, we're going back to the original intent of what enterprise architecture is, and that's fantastic. Number 3, how do you cost justify enterprise architecture? That's a question sort of from people that are steeped in the industrial age. It's really an industrial age question. As we're moving into the information age, that question has to be modified a little bit. Number 4, where should enterprise architecture reside in an organization? We hear this a lot. Where does it, quote, sit? And we'll be discussing what we see as, from our client perspective and our consulting practice, where this should be. Who's the audience for enterprise architecture? Often there's a question that's there, and we'll get into that discussion. When do I need to do enterprise architecture? Do I do it every day? Do I do it once a week, once a month, once a year? How does that actually occur? Why should an organization do enterprise architecture? What's the reasoning for it? And one of the things I'm going to say right up front here, it is not only to build systems, and this is what we consider to be EA 2.0 was in that direction, but EA 1.0 and EA 3.0, which we're now getting back into, it is much, much broader than that. Next, what is an enterprise architecture framework? In the field of enterprise architecture, there is not even an understanding or an agreement as to what a framework is, and we're going to discuss that a little bit. The other thing I want to emphasize here, from our understanding of practices outside of enterprise architecture and IT, in order to have a profession, there has to be one frame of reference. You can't roll your own, and you can't have multiple frames of references that are there. So you can sort of see the maturity of where we are right now. Next topic, what is an architecture methodology? Lots of discussion about this. Most of the things that we see out there are really knowledge bases rather than a process with a beginning and a middle and an end, and we'll be discussing the details about that. What does enterprise architecture certification actually mean? Unfortunately, right now in this area, there is a lot of organizations that claim certification through various means, and we're going to try to address this a little bit. It is not a great thing right now as far as consistency as to what enterprise architecture certification means, and once again, I believe it's because of the maturity level we're at right now with enterprise architecture. What's the background required for a great enterprise architect? This is something that we have been studying quite a bit because we have lots of clients. We're very fortunate to have lots of clients and lots of people that are doing this. And some of the things in this section may surprise you, some of them may not. And we'll get into what we see as the profile for that. How do I get started? How do I actually launch a particular effort? We see people having a very difficult time. Let's say they've come out of a training program or a certification program, so to speak. What do I do Monday morning? And we'll give you some hints as to how that evolved. So let's get right into this. This is the definition that we use for enterprise architecture. And I'm going to take some time on this slide because it is, to us, the most vital thing of anything in our discussion today in this webinar. And we define enterprise architecture as explicitly representing an organization's desired state and as-is state. Let me take that first section apart here for just a moment. Explicit representations. What we're talking about here is a series of representations about architecture. What we tell people is that you have an enterprise architecture. The problem is it is usually implicit. It's in the minds of all the people in the organization, or some of the minds of the people in the organization. Or what's worse possibly is a person has multiple suggestions of what an enterprise architecture is. So what we say to people is that enterprise architecture is making the implicit explicit so that we can recognize what that is. An organization, all we're saying there is some boundary condition. And within that boundary condition of what you're architecting, the concept of integration will hold. Outside of that boundary, you have the concept of interfacing. I didn't say one is correct and one is incorrect, but they are very, very different. So for example, if you have the most beautiful architected kitchen and you have the most beautiful architected dining room, it doesn't mean that you can get from the dining room to the kitchen or the kitchen from the dining room just because. You have to essentially make sure that it is architected for the whole. And you can't mush these things together afterwards. Of course, mushing is a technical term, as we all know, that's there. So this is kind of important as to what the situation is as far as what you're architecting. Desired state and then as-is state. This is from our consulting practice. We see that it is vital for the enterprise to first look at where it wants to go and then look at where it is. And then you can, of course, build a roadmap from the as-is state to the desired state. This is about the human condition of understanding or exploring things rather than becoming myopic. What we see is if we start with the as-is state, it's very difficult to break out of that. Next thing, transforming the organization through a set of independent, non-redundant artifacts. Fancy, fancy, fancy phrase, essentially saying that there is a set of mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive, mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive things that describe the enterprise. And we're going to tell you what those are. There's no magic here at all as far as what they are. But there's a set of things that describe anything. And I know that sounds kind of broad and possibly unbelievable, but 7,000 years of history tell us what's here right now. So there's a set of elements that we need to understand what those are. We refer to those as the architectural understanding. Next comma, defining how these artifacts interrelate with each other. That is what we refer to as the implementation composites. And most of the people that we see doing architecture are actually doing only 50%. They're doing the second things. Data flow diagrams, use cases, business process modeling notation, scenario planning are all in the second category of defining relationship models. Please again, I didn't say they were bad, but they're really not architecture. They're about implementation. because they're taking two independent or more variables and combining them way too early. So the architectural elements are considered to be equivalent to the engineering understanding in the physical world. The implementation or the relationship representations are equivalent in the physical world to the manufacturing representations. And of course, we know in the physical world we need both. But the architecture models are the ones that actually feed the implementation. You can't do it the other way. You will not see the gaps and the redundancies in the organization if you just start with the implementation composites. So in the physical world, we figured this out a long time ago, that there's two sets of representations. Architecture and implementation, the equivalency is engineering and manufacturing. Now, a lot of enterprise architecture efforts that we've seen stop there. They say, hey, we got these models, isn't this wonderful? Let's hang some medals on us. Well, we're not even close to being done here, because the objective is to develop a set of prioritized, aligned initiatives and capabilities needed to meet the organization's goals. The output of this is what I need to move forward. And it's the phrases that we use are initiatives or capabilities. There again is a lot of language issues out there in enterprise architecture and IT that have yet to be sorted out. Now, if anyone's interested in our definitions, of course, you can go to our website. We make all of these definitions very explicit as we move forward. So the end product of this is a series of not just models, but projects or programs or initiatives or capabilities, whatever term you're comfortable with, to meet the organizational goals. The next comma is something that we have been working on for quite some time, the concept of communicating this understanding to stakeholders. And the phrase that we use is the enterprise architecture representations need to be human consumable. Now, there's another set of representations, which are the implementation composites, that are built for compilers, and those are compiler consumables. So we have actually architectural understandings that are human consumable, and then we have the implementation composites are the manufacturing or the implementation representations. The other thing that we now have to deal with is the human condition in the 2015 timeframe. One of the great things that we see out there right now is Twitter and Facebook and all this jittering that's going on. If I don't get a message every 3-4 milliseconds, you're sort of wondering if anybody cares about you anymore. Well, decades ago, it was a little bit different, but now we have to react to this. And essentially, what the reaction is to us is that any deliverable that comes out of enterprise architecture must be able to be understood by a stakeholder, and this is not a joke, in less than 90 seconds. It doesn't mean that the stakeholder will know how to build this artifact, but the stakeholder essentially will understand what it is and be able to understand and react to it. And that 90 seconds is very, very important, because that's what we learn from the human and organizational behavioralists, is the tolerance nowadays for understanding virtually anything, because everybody is Twittering and Facebooking and answering emails and getting jittery as they're walking down the hallway if the vibration doesn't occur that's there. And the final part of this is advancing the organization from its as-is state to its desired state. I want to emphasize, again, the stakeholders. We are on a campaign, there's a little smile on my face, to get rid of the word user. This is a really horrible thing to call the people that pay our bills. Now, bear with me for a few minutes here, and hopefully you'll see the humor but the seriousness. There are only two pseudo-professions out there that call the people that pay the bills users. One is, unfortunately, the illicit drug trade, and the other is information technology. What's fascinating is the parallels. We both get the customer hooked. We charge them more and more for less product. Now, with that humor, there's a bit of seriousness. We need to think about the people as customers, and everything that we do. We can't go to our customer and say, you don't understand. And that's the problem. Once you understand, come back to us. No, no, no. As a customer, they can walk away from us. Whether they can walk away literally or figuratively, that's the image that we need in our mind. This is very, very important. So enterprise architecture is explicitly representing an organization's desired state and as a state, transform the organization through a set of independent, non-redundant artifacts, defining how these artifacts interrelate with each other, and then developing a set of prioritized aligned initiatives or capabilities needed to meet the organization's goals, communicating that understanding to stakeholders, and advancing the organization from its as-is state to its desired state. That's the definition that we use for enterprise architecture. Now, as you see here, there is another alternative definition, and this one comes from someone that some of you may be familiar with, a gentleman named Tony Scott. And Tony Scott is someone that we've had the privilege of working with for almost 3 decades now, 30 years. And we met Tony Scott when he was at Bristol Myers Squibb, and he graced us with asking us to do some work for him there in architecture. Then he became the Chief Technology Officer of General Motors, and once again he engaged us with some work there. Then he became the CIO of the Walt Disney Companies. As you can see, he doesn't hold the job very long at the Walt Disney Companies. Then he became the CIO of a little software company called Microsoft, and once again he graced us with having us come in for quite some time to help them out in some things that they were doing. Then he went to VMware, and most recently, which should be fascinating to all of us, I just talked to you about a gentleman that has done this 5 times already. He is now, as of about 90 days ago, the Federal Chief Information Officer of the United States government. Salute the flag. And talk about challenges. I had the pleasure of having dinner with Tony a few weeks ago, and he aged a lot over the last 90 days. Obviously, you're seeing a lot of the things that he's dealing with right now in the public, whether it's the NSA situation or the Office of Personnel Management and the hacking that's going on there. All of these things are obviously affecting his daily routine, to say the least, and I'm going to leave it there. But he looks at enterprise architecture as an illumination mechanism on how the organization and all of its members can achieve its objectives through the creation of a series of engineered models and project initiatives. You can see the parallels that can easily be understood. Again, that phrase about understanding by all the people associated with the organization that's there. Now, what are these artifacts? These artifacts, as you see here on page 4, quite simply, have been around since recorded history, since people had started writing things down. It's what, how, where, who, when, and why. Now, these are referred to essentially as the interrogatives in the physical world. And in our world, whys are strategies and goals, how are processes and activities, what's are materials and things, and the other phrase that you may see there in white font is the word data. Business is not interested in data because data is actually the representation of the things of interest to the business. It's the representation. It's not the actual things. That's why we use the term materials and things. Who are the roles and responsibilities or the skills? The where are the locations and geography? On the when are the events and triggers. And just a little bit point here on the when, the events and triggers. We have been at this for quite some time, and what's shocking to us when we walk into an organization is that this particular artifact, the events and triggers, is most of the time not even talked about or thought about in the organization. And it happens to be 2 things. One is, it is the largest of the models for an enterprise. A lot of people think they're process-driven, organizations think they're process-driven, but they're actually event-driven, and events trigger process actions. And the events and understanding the events are the real key to enterprise agility. Enterprise agility does not come through handcrafting programs. It just can't. It has to come from other things, and it has to do with understanding the events in the organization that's there. These things are called interrogatives. The other thing we have to understand is the constituencies and what's referred to as the transformations. And the transformations we're talking about here are stratified into 5 segments: understanding the business, understanding the relationships, specifying the components and services, identifying the technology, and selecting the solutions that are there. This concept also has a scientific basis, and if you want to look up a fancy word, the phrase is called reification. Reification is the science behind taking something that's very abstract and breaking it down into a series of transformations, not decompositions, but transformations into the physical solution that's there. So the science that we use is interrogatives and reification as the basis for the framework that we have. What is an enterprise? The word enterprise is sometimes a loaded term because people say enterprise architecture or business architecture, once again without a frame of reference. So it's hard to communicate. To us, an enterprise essentially is a scoping phrase. An enterprise to one person could be an enterprise somewhere else. So for example, at the Walt Disney Companies, is the enterprise theme parks and resorts? Yes. Is the enterprise the Walt Disney Company? Yes. Is it the cruise lines? Yes. So we have to define what the enterprise means to us. What we have to recognize is that you can't post-integrate something. If you have two disparate architectures and you try to bring them together, it will essentially be about interfacing that's there. Now, how long has enterprise architecture been around? This is something that's important to us because of the history that's there. As I mentioned to you, we believe that we are in enterprise architecture 3.0. This began by a gentleman named P. Dwayne Dewey Walker. I'm not sure how many are familiar with this, but if anyone should be considered the grandfather or the father of this particular topic, it is Dewey Walker. And for those of you who know a little bit about the history, you'll also know that one of the people working for Dewey happened to be John Zachman. And I know how John, is portrayed out there, and John is a friend of ours. I want to say this up front, but if you talk to John and ask him about Dewey, he will tell you that Dewey was his boss during the time that this was going on. It says here, in 1966, Dewey was named the manager of information systems planning at IBM's headquarters. And a year later, this is a very important phrase, he became the firm's first manager of information systems architecture. Now, why information systems? Of course, that was IBM's domain. Please notice what happened here. This is not subtle, and in most enterprises, this has not been picked up yet. They started thinking about planning, and very quickly they recognized that you can't plan for something that you don't see. And therefore, the objective is architecture, and once you have the architecture, you can then plan its execution that's there. I know in most organizations that's not the way the things are done, but this is kind of an interesting insight from the early days of the architecture work, that's there. So architecture is essentially the understanding of the business, and then you plan how to actually execute its strategy. And we suggest that architecture is the enabler of business strategy that's there. Once we see the architecture, we have a strategy, and then we can move forward. In this capacity, he oversaw many of the developments of important systems analysis tools and helped so many of IBM's new programs to other Fortune 500 companies. In 1970, this is fascinating, Walker was commissioned to establish a national marketing approach for IBM. Marketing? What does that have to do with architecture? Well, guess what? These clever people at IBM figured out if they had your blueprint, using the physical analogy, they could sell into it. Hey, I got the blueprint here of your company. Let me see, you need 2,600 2x4s, you need 4,000 pounds of nails, you need 60 gallons of paint, you need some 2x4s, you need some windows, some doors. You can sell into the organization once you have essentially the architectural understanding that's there. And they established this program called Business Systems Planning. That's what Dewey and his organization of 4 people developed in the early days. And this is a picture of the manual that they published many, many years ago. And I want to show you, I have a copy of this thing. The reason I show it to you is not to brag. It's just to say this is real. This has been around for almost 5 decades, 4.5 decades. And as I said, we're into 3.0 of enterprise architecture. Just as a point of reference, why do I say 3.0? 1.0 is what Dewey and his people developed, which is a understanding of the business regardless of the technology component that was there. I say this humbly, but with a bit of seriousness. EA 2.0 is where we see most organizations, which is the capturing, or a phrase that one of our clients used, the hijacking of enterprise architecture by the information technology organization to make it about systems. Now we're seeing that people recognize that's really not what this is about. It's not about compiling programs. It's about figuring out what to compile, and that's why we're back to what we consider to be EA 1.0, and we're just calling it EA 3.0. And we're seeing this movement back to the original intent that's there, and we're very, very happy about that. Now, I have to say that our intent has never changed. We're just seeing a lot of the industry recognizing the early practices that are out there. How do you cost justify enterprise architecture? I'm not going to read this bed sheet of things that are out there. There is a tremendous amount of things that are there. But here's the issue in our profession right now. Everybody wants a metric or a measure, but nobody's doing metrics or measurement. Duh. So what do we actually do here? How do we address this? And this is one of this dilemma. Well, we need to justify enterprise architecture. Well, nobody's measuring anything, but everybody wants measurements of something new. We look at it a little bit differently. Yes, we can answer the questions, but the reason we say that this is a industrial age question is because the information age is about this. Now, why do I say this? How do you cost justify in the physical world an assembly plant for an automobile? How do you cost justify the marketing costs about an automobile in the physical world? Well, it's not about the marketing program or about the assembly. It's about the end product and the returns it has over time. So what we need to look at as far as cost justifying enterprise architecture is what is the cost of doing, you start writing the code and we figure out what the user has in mind today, which I jokingly refer to as the life cycle we have today, versus an architected approach. That's the way we can figure out what the benefit is. Now on our website, there's one case study from a colleague of ours that actually has gone through, two organizations have actually gone through and measured at excruciating levels of detail the cost from the top-down approach, architected down to excruciating levels of detail, versus you start writing the code and we'll figure out what the user has in mind later. And the information is on the website, and this group, this is not our numbers, it's their numbers, found a 10 times increase in productivity. I didn't say 10%, 10 times, measured at the implemented data element level. That's how precise this was. That's pretty good. And so unfortunately, we don't have a plethora of things that are out there, but there are some things that are out there that you can hang your hat on. Where should enterprise architecture practice reside in an organization? Well, this is the question about who has the skills versus where does the information lie to us. And therefore, we're going to say it is not that important where the organization sits on who has the skills to do enterprise architecture. The better question is, where is the information that comes out of that? Now, the analogy I use is that if you had the privilege, pleasure, or frustration in building a house, you went to a professional architecture firm. They don't own the stuff. They develop the stuff for you. You are the owner of this information. And therefore, as the owner of the information, you don't reside in the architectural office, so to speak. They are your supplier. They are your service group. You own the blueprints. You own the information that's there. So if you define enterprise architecture as we have here, ideally, the architecture practice would not sit in the information technology operations organization. I want to be very clear here. The day-to-day activities are really in conflict with the architectural activities that are there. Architecture is a bit longer in its lifetime versus the implementation or fire drills that go on every day. And we know that's going to happen. There is no right answer. It is desirable to have a direct line to the Chief Information Officer. It's even more effective if we actually have a dotted line to the business executives. And we see this happening now in organizations all over the world, that they recognize that this is about business understanding. And there are many names out there now for people that are doing this that are not called enterprise architects anymore. One that we hear is BTP, Business Technology Partner, that are there. We see people that are called strategy enablers. There's lots of different phrases that try to get people to understand that it is different. Now, at the bottom of this page, if you define enterprise architecture as enterprise information technology architecture, which is what we see most people are doing, in other words, systems focus, then typically that would be the CIO or the CTO in the organization that's there. So one of the things that we see here, of course, is what is the definition of enterprise architecture. Who's the audience for enterprise architecture? Well, we suggest to you there are two audiences in general at the highest level: the human consumable audience, meaning the customer, and the compiler consumable audience, which is the technology professionals. And so we see the whole enterprise understanding this. Enterprise architecture is used for an understanding of the enterprise, as-is analysis, what-if analysis, risk understanding, cause and effect. There is a tremendous amount of things that enterprise architecture, not IT architecture, can do for the organization. Look at consequences of actions before those actions are taken. There is a huge number of things that can be done. So the audience is really anyone that is consuming a change requirement in the organization itself. When do I need enterprise architecture? This is a fascinating phrase. In the physical world, we figured this out. Nobody would start building a 100-story building without a heck of a lot of architecture. Nobody would start building a Boeing 747 without a heck of a lot of architecture. Nobody would be building a cruise liner without a heck of a lot of architecture. Now, if you're building a log cabin, maybe you don't need much architecture. If you're building a balsa wood airplane for your child, maybe you don't need much architecture. But even then, you know that there are those explicit representations of even something as simple as that. So the answer is all the time. It's about business understanding. And at the point of the organizations right now, the baseline for addressing complexity and change throughout recorded history, the baseline for addressing complexity and change is architecture. And your organizations, every one of your organizations, I'm sure, are going through massive change continuously and are complex. Now, the key thing is that what we want to do here is not to add to that complexity through enterprise architecture. We want to use enterprise architecture as the mechanism, to understand that complexity. So the last thing we want to do is to have a complex enterprise architecture activity that is adding to the complexity of the enterprise. The purpose of enterprise architecture is to understand things are complex, not add to that complexity that is there. Why should you do enterprise architecture? To us, there's four fundamental reasons. The first one is to understand the business better. They understand the customer better, however you'd like to put it. We truly believe that organizations are not being yelled at because the programs aren't compiling. We believe people are getting yelled at because what's being compiled isn't what they were looking for. It's about business understanding. To reduce potential confusion, one common language of communication between the business and the technology people. Now, let me just hold that for a moment. There's actually three sets of conversations that go on in an enterprise. Business people talking to business people. We as architects can help them and facilitate building a common understanding and language for the business people. Second set of conversations are technology professionals talking to technology professionals. And the one that everybody talks about, which can only occur if the other two are in place with a high degree of correctness, is business talking to technology and technology talking to the business. So there's actually three sets of conversations. Once again, we jump to the third one because that's the one that we think about. But in order to have the third one, we have to have a business language that's consistent and a technology language is consistent. To better align resources and skills. That's the other reason that we do enterprise architecture, because not everyone can do everything in your organization. And finally, to be as responsive as possible to the enterprise needs as the business changes. Architecture is the baseline for managing change. You architect and then you make the change. Wash my mouth out with soap if I use the word enterprise architecture and documentation in the same sentence. Architecture is not documentation. Documentation occurs after the change is made. Architecture occurs before the change is made. A very, very important distinction. And there's, again, lots of different reasons to do this. It is the foundation in the information age, of a business competitive advantage. It's not the Boeing 747 that makes Boeing profits per se. It's the understanding how to build those things, how to modify those things, how to create variations of those things better than anybody else. The end product is a disposable element. I know that sounds kind of crazy, but that's not the key to Boeing. Boeing's success, or the cruise liner's success, or XYZ organization, is their ability to react to the market faster and better and cheaper than anyone else. It's there. What is an enterprise architecture framework? Unfortunately, in the field of enterprise architecture, there is even confusion about what a frame of reference is, let alone what a framework is. We believe that eventually there will be one enterprise framework. This is our modification, the actual phrase that we like to use is our elaboration of the seminal work of John Zachman. We believe that his work at IBM and his continuing research work on that same framework that he developed when he was at IBM is the baseline. And it has the elements that we have seen in the interrogatives and the reification. It contains it all. And we want to say something here that we say all the time in public. If there is something in your enterprise that does not, it cannot be represented by this framework, then somebody will get a Nobel Prize. And that's the scientific hypotheses we use at this particular point. Nobody can prove that this is correct. That's the scientific hypotheses in the physical world. But nobody has been able to prove this incorrect. We have been able to show that other frames of references are lacking in certain areas. So therefore, we believe that eventually the work of John Zachman, and why would we call this an elaboration? Since we are a practitioner firm, we have added understanding of each one of the architectural elements, each one of the composites, each one of the, quote, cells of the framework, as we call them. We have essentially an elaboration of all that from a practice standpoint. Each one of these is fleshed out with examples of how essentially you use this seminal piece of work and day-to-day practice that's there. What is an enterprise architecture methodology? A methodology is different than a frame of reference. A methodology is a recipe, if you want to use that phrase. It's practices and procedures applied to a specific body of knowledge to move forward in one direction. You can see the confusion out there. You sometimes go on the internet and people say, our methodology is framework neutral. Let me say it a little bit differently with a bit of humor here. That means that I can take a recipe for baking a cake and apply it to the enterprise. No. A methodology has a dependency on a framework. A framework can have many different methodologies. In other words, different approaches to producing the end product. So there's many different ways using the base ingredients in making a chocolate cake. You can use the same ingredients, but the methodology, the process of doing that can be done different ways. And as a firm, if we've added anything to the body of knowledge out there, this has been our work for the past N decades, where N is a few decades. We have been concentrating on actually doing enterprise architecture. That's been our specialty area. What does enterprise architecture certification actually mean? This is tough for me to say as somebody that practices in this particular area. The current state of enterprise architecture certification is really troubling. Okay. We don't believe that passing a multiple choice, and the humorous phrase we use, a multiple guess exam, makes one an architect, especially if you can go out on the internet and find all those answers. And we get emails almost on a weekly basis, and this is not a joke. Send us $29 and we'll send you your enterprise architecture certification. This should scare the bejesus out of us. This shows the elixir salesman approach that we have. This is kind of troubling. However, we know from historical activities, this is a passing phase. We're in this hype cycle right now, and hopefully this will be addressed relatively soon. People say, well, what does relatively mean? Well, I don't know. I wish I could say. That'd be fantastic. The concept of not demonstrating competency when you have certification is the issue. That means that there's no theoretical soundness to the situation. Confusion as to what a methodology is. Confusion what a framework is. The other thing that we can't believe is that the certification never expires. A professional engineer, a medical professional, an accountant, an attorney, all require essentially some kind of repeat demonstration of competency. It's not something that is grandfathered in forever, and we see this all the time. Send us your $29.95, we'll send you a certificate. The other thing that is kind of unnerving is there's a lot of vendors and some certification organizations that are locked at the hip. And if you go into these certifications, you start seeing the influence that's there. That's not healthy for the profession. It's healthy for the economics of the organization, but this is something that's troubling. They haven't separated those things out. And what you get essentially is a not best of breed, but the worst of the breed. In other words, it's what can you live with when you have 200 and 300 vendors paying money to essentially contribute to this particular effort. The future state of enterprise architecture certification and some of the things that are going on, and we'll humbly suggest this is what we're doing, really is the direction that the profession is going to go into, and that's what the rest of the physical world has already done. And that's a demonstrated understanding of doing something. You're performing brain surgery. Here is the demonstrated practice. I just did it, and the person's alive. Fantastic. That's great. Okay? If you've done 10 of them, you become a XYZ surgeon. If you do 100 of them, you become a surgical fellow or something like that. The ability to develop an enterprise architecture after the certification program. We believe that the certification body is not just about certification, it's about doing actual work. It's not about just a body of knowledge. It's allowing people to actually build an enterprise architecture when they get out of the certification. Traceable teaching of how you move from theory to practice. Is there a theoretical soundness here, or do you just have 87 techniques and 900 pages of text that are there? Real examples from real organizations in the certification. There should be the ability for you to see how others have done it. It may be masked for confidentiality issues, but you should be able to see artifacts on how this is actually developed. The other thing is that professional certification will require periodic recertification. Not trying to make this difficult, but it really makes sense. And then, of course, we will see more and more certifying bodies become totally vendor neutral. This is very important, and the field is going in that direction. What's the background required for a great enterprise architect? Once again, unfortunately, there is no one answer to this question, but from our experience, kind of surprising to some of you possibly, the connection between highly skilled technology people and being a good enterprise architect is dubious. What we're saying is the best programmers, the best analysts may not be the best architects. But let's look in the physical world for a moment. Does the architect of a house have to know how to wire a 110-volt circuit? The answer is no. Do they have to know about that? Yes. Does the architect of a house have to know how to sweat copper pipes for water? The answer is no. Do they have to know about that concept? The answer is yes. It doesn't mean that if you are technology competent, you can't be an architect, but the correlation there is dubious at best. What we see is people from different disciplines have been shown to be just as good, if not better, at enterprise architecture as those steeped in technology, because they're more interested in understanding the opportunity or the problem rather than looking at a solution at time zero. It's a partnership. It's a partnership. Enterprise architecture skill set is not only around technology enablement. Again, it's about business understanding. In fact, a technology focus may be an inhibitor in some cases that we've seen to do actual enterprise architecture work. So I want to mention again that I'm not suggesting that if you are steeped in technology, you cannot be a good enterprise architect. But I am going to suggest to you that that is not a qualification that should stop people from becoming enterprise architects. And the last thing we see is soft skills and archaeology, using the term archaeology in quotes here. Understanding, be able to deduce the understanding of the business through a series of representations is what a great enterprise architect does. And just as a side note here, as I said, in our continuing work in providing you with some webinars on these topics, next month, and you'll get an email from us, we have a webinar that we're just announcing now on soft skills for architects. And we are pleased to have a gentleman join us. His name is Ken Nagus. I've had the pleasure of knowing Ken for many, many, many years, pleasurable years. Ken is a world-renowned expert in the soft skills area, and he is gracing us with providing a one-hour webinar next month on the soft skills about enterprise architecture, and hopefully you'll tune in for that also. I think you'll find Ken's webinar very, very fascinating that's there. How do I get started in developing an enterprise architecture? We're going to suggest that the phrase boil the ocean is something we always have to be careful of, whatever that phrase means that's there. I very rarely would suggest an organization do an enterprise-wide architecture at time zero. We have had those occasions where we've been asked to do that and been successful. However, because of the hype and confusion out there on what this is, we strongly recommend what we refer to as a demonstration project. And a demonstration project is a 2 elapsed week version of the methodology to produce what we commonly refer to and jokingly refer to as a 0.4 architecture. Now, we know we want to get to 1.0, but this is a demonstration of the techniques. And we hope somebody says, oh, that's what enterprise architecture is? Yeah, I want more of that. Once we get through that, there's a number of other things that we can do. One of the common things we see out there is the concept of portfolio rationalization, portfolio optimization. Using enterprise architecture techniques, 2 architectural artifacts that I showed you in the framework can provide you with a frame of understanding of the potential reduction in redundancies and costs and also gaps in the organization. And we call that portfolio rationalization. Less than enterprise architecture scope. A project, a program, a division, a department. Great way to begin doing this. The other thing that we see is quick strike opportunities. What do we mean by that? There has been an issue in the organization or the organization has had. Well, let's see if we can apply architectural techniques to essentially provide some clarity in that particular area. We call it architecture project coupling. And finally, and I know that this is absolutely a horrible suggestion, is why don't we architect IT? What do I mean by that? Why don't we architect the information technology organization, which is essentially a business within a business. It has goals, it has process, it has materials, it has organization, it has skills, it has events, it has all the components of the general business. Not only can we get some tremendous value there, but we can also essentially apply these techniques to ourselves to get practice and to essentially understand where there could possibly some opportunities in our own organization. And essentially at this point, our webinar is completed. And we want to suggest to you that from this webinar, hopefully your enterprise architecture journey begins. We are really pleased to have all of you there with us today. We are thrilled that we're actually ending a few minutes early. I know sometimes these things run long, and I hope that we were able to add some understanding to your organization. Now, once again, what we'll be doing is we'll be sending you an email link to our presentation if you'd like to review it again or pass that on to your clients. And finally, as I said, next month we will have a webinar on our soft skills. The month after that, meaning in August, we're going to have a little bit of a unique webinar where one of our clients who actually has done enterprise architecture internally will present their work as not a practitioner firm as a consultant, but actually the work that they have done using this methodology and provide some insight as to the things that they've approached and how they did it. And of course, that will be our August seminar, and we'll be continuing to do that. So once again, I thank you for your attention. I hope we've been able to add to your knowledge base, and go do enterprise architecture. Thanks again for your attention.